Hello, everyone. Welcome to this issue of the Debater's Perspective, where I get to sit down with intelligent debaters from across the world, discussing global issues and also issues that you debate in your debate rooms for those of you who are debaters. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. My name is Eze Mwakuba, and I'll be your anchor person for today. First, the preamble. In 2019, to distance the country from ethnic federalism and ethnic nationalist policies, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed merged the ethnic and region-based constituent parties of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front and several opposition parties into his Prosperity Party. The Tigray People's Liberation Front, popularly known as the TPLF, a politically powerful entity that had dominated Ethiopian politics for 27 years as a repressive regime through a one-party dominant system, refused to join the new party. The TPLF then alleged that Abiy Ahmed became an illegitimate ruler because the general elections scheduled for August 2020 were postponed to 2021 due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The TPLF, led by its chairman, went ahead with regional elections in Tigray in September 2020 in defiance of the federal government, which then declared the Tigray elections as illegal. Ethiopia, as we know it right now, is at war. What is now dubbed as the Tigray War is an ongoing civil war that began on November 3rd, 2020 in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. The local Tigray Defense Forces are fighting the Ethiopian National Defense Forces in coalition with several other parties that are involved. All sides, as reported by UN and US observers, have committed war crimes during the conflict. The war is now being touted as sprouting or leading into some humanitarian crisis within the region. Most notably, it is now being envisaged that if not checked, the war might lead to the destabilization of the Horn of Africa. To discuss this issue with me today is a debater and an adjudicator who needs little to no introduction. His name is Njuguna Macharia. Is a Kenyan debater and an adjudicator, was a finalist judge at the World University Debating Championship. A lot of you would know him as Baba, but like I said, he's a very celebrated debater and a very decorated adjudicator as well. Thank you very much, Njuguna, for coming on the show today.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here.
Great. So East Africa or the Eastern Africa is more or less under threat, do you think, because of the violence that has now ensued in Ethiopia? Do you think that this has any impact, or is it strictly a civil war as it has been described, across many borders?
Yeah, I guess the answer to that is that I guess we all know that war is political in nature, and the problem with war is that it has trickle-down effects on other people. The war that is happening currently is leading to a lot of displacement. So the hardest hit people are because of where Tigray is located, are likely to be Sudan and South Sudan. So a lot of refugees and humanitarian issues are being dealt with at the Sudan border. And they are really it's reported about 2 million people have fled from Tigray and are moving towards Ethiopia, Sudan, and that's where really it's hardest hit. I think there's a lot of also trickle down spillover effects. Some are coming to Kenya, others are going to Uganda. So, but we're less hit towards south of the border, and towards the north, I guess it's much harder hit. So most of the refugees are fleeing towards Sudan.
Okay, just before we dig into it very deeply, for the purpose of the audience who might not have a lot of background on this, please give us a non-biased background of what you think is the actual cause of the war.
Yeah, I guess it's actually an East African problem that most of the time, and it's really a colonial problem with regards to how the borders were drawn. Ethiopia initially was, there's a long history there, but let me go to the more relevant history. I think it's with regards to how the state was formed and how specifically it operates. The beginning of Ethiopia was a monarchy. That's how they were able to defeat the Italians when they were during the fight for colonization. As you're all aware, Ethiopia was not colonized by any colonial power. So they maintained their power, and they had a very strong monarchy that ruled, especially between the 1900s to 1800s. And what happened after that is that towards the 60s, 70s, there was a military the coup, and there was a dictatorship then that came in that was literally fueled by communist influence. So a lot of communist, it was a communist military party, and it sort of like overthrew the monarchy and it took power. Now the Tigray conflict starts there because what happened is that the military overthrow, the military coup, sort of led to like this disbursement of regional bodies. And what happened is that Ethiopia has 80 ethnic groups, and all of them sort of like formed their own militias to defend themselves against this military power. And what happened, especially towards the 80s and the 90s, is that there was an offense against the offensive launched by these militias against the military power. Now, this is where Tigray now became powerful, because if you check the stats, Tigray is not one of the largest populations in Ethiopia. It's actually about 6%. But what happened is that they launched one of the strongest offensives against this military power that was there, the coup, the general that was there, the Communist Party. And they were assisted by the Eritreans. And those were the two most powerful. There was the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Party, and the EPLF, the Eritrean People Liberation Party. And they successfully overthrew the government. Now, what happened is when they left, when the military was overthrown, Eritrea declared independence and moved out, meaning that the only power remaining in Ethiopia was the Tigrays. And when they now formed power, for the next 30 years, Tigray had literally a lot of power within the government because they were the revolutionaries. They're the ones who overthrew and did the most to do that. And what led to now what we see today is that what Abiy Ahmed did is that he sidelined a lot of the Tigray people when he came into power. He's removing them from power. He's taking them out of the powerful positions. He's reducing their influence, and they are not having it. So that was sort of like a trigger for what's happening. And now Tigrays are trying to like retain their power because they thought Abiy Ahmed would be one of them, but that's not what specifically happened. I think he decided to sort of sideline them, and it's led to what we're seeing today, especially with regards to its power and its politics. It has very little to do with what do you call it, human rights. I think the Tigrays are very interested in retaining power. And of course, there are the triggers, which we'll discuss later. But if what I think is happening is just power politics and the East African problem of too many diverse ethnic groups and all of them existing independently. So there's no national identity. Their ethnic identity precedes their national identity. So they'll fight to defend that ethnic identity.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's interesting that you mentioned the dual personality of the prime minister, because this seems to be like an inside job. He seems to be undoing his own people, like, or the people he was once loyal to. Why do you think that's why do you think the relationship fell apart? Because if he's a member of the TPLF, or was, I think, like a senior person in the government back then, I think he was in charge of either information or communication or something like that, intelligence, yes. So if he was that high ranking and then got power, what happened? Like, what changed? We could have just moved on and could have been business as usual for the Tigrayans.
Yeah, I guess, and I think there are two things we can say here. The first is that he was part of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. But what you need to understand as to how Abiy Ahmed ascended into power is that it was not like peaceful. There was a lot of protest between 2015 and 2018 against the Ethiopian party, because what that was, it was not a party, it was a coalition. So every ethnic group had their own party, and then they all came to form this coalition. And there was a lot of protest about that coalition, especially because it was very Tigray dominated. Most of the soft power was held by them. So when Abiy Ahmed came into power, I think what happened is that he needed to change something, because the people were really not happy with the way things were being run. But what the Tigray people thought is that he's going to sort of like maintain the status quo, but he's a new face. And so he was caught between maintaining the powers that be while also showing the people that he's a revolutionary, which is what caused a lot of problems. The first thing was he declared peace with Eritrea. Notice that Eritrea and Ethiopia had been at war, and guess who was in charge of Ethiopia when Eritrea and Ethiopia were at war? The Tigrays. So there was a lot of things he was doing that was undoing a lot of the power that the Tigrays had. And I think for me, it was more about he's trying to clean up house. At the same time, he's trying to maintain the powers that be. And I think it's just a balancing act that was probably not working, that was bound to fail eventually. One had to give. And that's why he formed the New Prosperity Party. And now that's what's triggered a lot of the problems that's happening, because now the party that had a lot of power and the Tigrays had a lot of influence in no longer had the power, and he was now creating a new coalition to cement a different form of authority, and this was not going well. I do think there maybe is a Tigray perspective to it. I wouldn't see exactly what it is, because a lot of the conflicts or a lot of the party politics have mostly been held by the Tigray. So it's very difficult to see how them being sidelined is a huge issue, because they've been in power for 30 years and the people were not having it. They were probably one of the most powerful centers of power in Ethiopia for the past 30 years.
Okay, so the news has it that he sparked the offensive. He declared the offensive first. Do you think this was too early in his tenure?
There's two stories to it. One, that he declared the offensive to try and neutralize them before they became a problem. The other story, which is the official story that's coming out, is that there's Ethiopians, or the Tigrays, launched a preemptive attack on the military base in Tigray and the northern front. And what happened is that once they launched that to try and take military weapons from one of the barracks towards the north in the Tigray region, then the prime minister responded. This is what happens on November 4th. That's the story. There are those two sides, but I think you all know news. It could be either or. We don't really know. So the point is, one of them attacked the other first. The official story is that the Tigrays launched first against the military base, and then the Ethiopian national government responded.
Oh, well, I think that's the official story from the federal government perspective, because there's also a lot of story about how, in a press conference, the prime minister had declared, an all-out assault. But it's interesting that you try to wave away the argument of humanitarian, the humanitarian angle to this, because again, there's a lot of news outlets reporting that the Ethiopian government is using starvation as a weapon to subdue their enemies. If that is true,
I think it's possible. I think it's very possible. I think it's very, very possible. I think I've followed this story for a year, and I think it keeps coming up, and that there's a lot of, and I think the way they're doing it is that they're not cutting out humanitarian aid. I think what they're doing is like creating so many barriers to it getting there that it's sort of like it's creating this hunger. It's actually a tactic of war. And I think the other thing they're doing is that, Tigray, or Ethiopia in itself, is a very landlocked country. It has no access to external food. So what happens is that all food that goes to Tigray mostly comes from the center, or the capital, which is Addis. They don't have any other outlets. The area is arid, so they can't farm themselves. Most of their food comes from other places. So there's also talks that the military has cut out the supplies towards that region. And I think this is also limiting the amount of food that's going. I think if there is a humanitarian crisis, to be honest, I don't think this is something you can wave away.
Okay, before we get into solution finding, or brainstorming around solutions, the Ethiopian government has reportedly done some alliance sort of thing with Eritrea. Do you think this is a wise decision, that coalition?
I don't think it's a wise thing. I think it's a coalition of convenience, because as I mentioned, right, when the Tigrays and the Eritreans worked together to overthrow the communist military party that was there, the Eritreans went to declare independence, and the Tigrays were not having it. So that started the war between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And I think the Ethiopians really hit hard on Eritrea. In fact, there was a long time Eritrea was not recognized as a country because of Ethiopia's influence. There was a lot of things that Ethiopia did to sort of limit the nationality and the sovereignty of Eritrea, and there was just war. So when Abiy Ahmed says, look, the TPLF, I'm fighting them, of course, Eritrea is headed by a military dictator, right? Yeah. He's been waiting for an opportunity to get back at the TPLF for everything they've done. So the relationship there, I think, is a relationship of convenience. It's one that serves both interests. They both need to get rid of the TPLF or somehow neutralize them in one way. And both of them have a huge incentive to do that. So it's maybe not wise, but I think it is convenient for both of these actors.
Okay, so do you think that would have, assuming there's an escalation, because right now US forces, they're all advising their people to move out, or foreigners should get out. So in fact, there's a lot of speculation right now, which is very sad, that Ethiopia would collapse. That's the language that is being used in the media, that Ethiopia is on the brink of collapse because the rebels are actually progressing towards the capital. So in the event that this happens, let's say Ethiopia loses, what is the overarching harm, right, for the Horn of Africa, that region generally? What do you think might happen?
I think it's hard for the state to collapse because the state has a lot of power. But I think the more recent news is reporting that Abiy Ahmed has managed to sideline also the Oromo people, who are the second largest ethnic group, and they are joining forces with the Tigrays to launch an assault. And that just makes it way more complicated than what was there before when you were just fighting the Tigrays, because the Oromos have huge power. They are a massive bloc. What would happen in the possibility, I don't think, and I think Western media has a way of painting things as I don't know how to explain it. They never really paint an accurate picture. I don't think Ethiopia, you can say, can collapse. I don't think a state collapses. I think what happens is that power shifts, and what happens when power shifts, it just realigns. So the worst case, in my opinion, is that you can find that Abiy Ahmed is overthrown, but what's likely to happen is that he's just going to be replaced by another conduit of the TPLF and maybe the Oromos, and maybe they just form another type of government. But I don't think you find a situation where everyone forms their own. I think there's a necessity, especially because of the nature of Ethiopia, to maintain the hegemony, the size, to leverage on natural resources from different regions. I don't think people want a situation where everyone goes their own way. So I think the state remains. What happens is a shift in power from what was Abiy Ahmed's Prosperity Party to back what was there in the status quo, which is coalitions of different regional governments just to serve their own ethnic interests. And then they have this unity banner, they'll probably call it something else, and then they continue as normal.
Okay, so let's now delve into solutions. What are the possible ways this could end?
The African solution to everything is always power sharing. So I guess Abiy Ahmed has to decide what he wants. He has to decide whether he wants to fight these people who I think have a lot of power, because for the last 30 years they've been in government. They have power, they have soft power, they have people support, and they are willing to leverage on Abiy Ahmed's sidelining of other groups to get other groups to fight them. And as I mentioned, every regional ethnic group has a militia. So it's not a state that has a monopoly of violence. Different groups have their own artilleries, they have their own militaries. So it makes it way more complicated. The first solution is that they just have to all sit down. And I think Abiy Ahmed promised it after the elections this year, that they would have a national consensus and dialogue about the way forward, something that never happened. I think that probably is the best solution for that problem, in terms of sit down with everyone, sit with the heads of these ethnic groups, find a party and a solution of power sharing that fits everyone, and Ethiopia can go back to what it was. The other solution, I think, is that the TPLF just has to decide what they want. You know, Eritrea did it, right? They decided to just decide and declare their own independence, and now they live on their own. The TPLF can decide to do that. But the reason why they will never do that, I think, is because the area in which they are in is very semi-arid. It has very low resource. It has literally little that it can offer in terms of economic potential. So I don't think they would be seeking some form of secession, which is why they really pursue the overthrowing of the government. I think that's either of the solutions. But the best one is just sitting down and actually forming a party and a government that is representative of ethnic interests and everyone who is there. Especially with the big powers, the Amhara, the Omoro, the Tigray, they have to sit at the Somali.
Okay, so I'm going to then discuss the external factors, or actors rather, that might be involved in this crisis. But before then, if you're just joining us, or if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing to this channel. Like I said, this is the Debater's Perspective, where we discuss with debaters from across the world on global issues that are currently trending. And this is a way for us to bridge the gap between the debate community and the rest of the non-debating world. But also, if you're a debater, this could also be a very good place for you to find matter for your upcoming debate tournaments as well. So please do want to subscribe, like, share, and do come around for subsequent editions or episodes. So back to you, Macharia. There is hardly an African conflict that doesn't have a twist of, you know, like a foreign body that has something to benefit. There's the presence of the US heavily in what's it called now, in Ethiopia right now. In fact, most of the news that you have all over the internet is coming up from their observers. What do you think is the plot here, right? What is the plot of the international community. I think largely the US anyway. The other forces that are largely known as UN, which we can say is at least neutral. But what do you think is the interest of the United States in the conflict?
I don't think the US has too big of an interest. I think US sees Ethiopia as a strategic ally, especially in the east, considering it's huge in terms of its population, it's huge in terms of its economic potential. I think the latest statements we have from the US say that they have warned the TPLF against trying to offend or trying to launch an offensive against Addis. This might imply that they're behind Abiy Ahmed and they're maybe behind what's going on. However, I don't like assuming things because everything I would say would be speculative. The only thing we know is that they've said that the capital city is out of bounds for the TPLF. So we don't know what that means. So if the TPLF probably attacks Addis, we will know exactly what the interests of the US are, because that's the only thing they've said. But I think the one thing I think I know for sure is that Ethiopia is massive. It has massive potential. It has massive resources. So anyone who has a strategic interest here is probably involved in one way or another in this war. Is it self-serving? Is it serving external actors? We don't know. The Gulf states are involved. Turkey is involved. A lot of Qatar, all those people are involved because Ethiopia is very linked to the Gulf also because of its Cushitic population, and also it's literally on the other side of that Gulf. So there's a lot of actors involved. What you don't know ever is what their underlying interests are. What you use is what they say. So what we can assume from what they say is that they're behind Abiy Ahmed, especially the West, specifically because of the sort of sentiments or the statements that they're making.
Okay, so my final question is maybe a little bit unrelated to this whole issue, but there seems to be this recent consciousness and uprising in many African states. Can we say that this democracy thingy is not necessarily working in Africa? Because like the TPLF, when they were in charge for 27 years, they are a repressive, government. They're not quite as democratic as we would like them to be. But we could say that at least they were largely unproblematic, right? And we have seen the same story in many other African countries where things were going well or quiet, even if it's not well, but I think things were relatively quiet before the introduction of a democratic process. Are we as Africans, averse to the idea of, democracies?
I've always been, I once, sorry, maybe because I was speaking to a debater. So okay, let me first answer the question. On the question of democracy working in Africa, so the TPLF was not unproblematic. They had a lot of issues. They repressed political opponents. They banned freedom of speech. It was not as democratic as you'd wish. They had a facade of democracy, but it was not really as democratic. And it was never really the Tigrays in power. They called it the Ethiopian People's Liberation Party, whatever they call it. But they are the ones really in charge of that party, considering they are the ones who overthrew the government to the most parts. So the question you say here is that, was it unproblematic? No, these were problematic actors, but they maintained a facade of democracy. And that's what led to the 2015 to 2017 protests, because people were claiming that there was just no freedom in Ethiopia, which is why Abiy Ahmed's main thing was trying to increase those freedoms. He increased freedom of the press, he increased the freedoms of people, he allowed more expression, he wasn't detaining prisoners. I think he ended up doing that eventually during the war. But the point is, there was that need for, or clamor for freedoms. Is there a crisis of democracy? I don't think so. I think that Africans have to define what it means to them. I think people tend to always try and use a metric of, oh, these are the sort of freedoms that you must have for you to be an African democracy, which is never really true. I think different countries have molded their own democracies in different ways. And what I was trying to say in the beginning was there's a trade-off, right? What Africans are, there's a need for power, especially towards advancing economic development. And some of these things require some strongman tactics. Sometimes it doesn't, we don't know. But there's always power struggles. It's always about power and interests. And that's what we never seem to get away from, because the issue is never democracy, it's who is in charge. So the TPLF doesn't care that it's a democracy. They care that they are no longer the ones calling the shots. Yeah. So it's always a problem of power and who is in charge. Look what happened in Sudan very recently. The military had sort of given a democracy, and then all of a sudden they decide, no, we want power back. And then they strike a deal and they decide, oh no, we are going back to what we were doing with the transitional government. I think it's always an issue of power and politics. It's never really an issue of democracy. I think there's no crisis of democracy. you're from Nigeria, Eze, I think your democracy works. I think people are just fighting over power and who is in charge and who is in what. I don't think there's a crisis of democracy here either, and in many places, but I do think there's an issue of power, and especially because of the ethnic identities and this underlying identities, it always brings a problem, whether it's religious or ethnic or whatever it is, it always supersedes national identity and it always leads to these conflicts.
Well, thank you very much, Njuguna Macharia, for serving us your intelligence on this episode today. Before I let you go, I'm going to put you on the spotlight for 1 second, as I always do. So we have, of course, non-debaters that watch here, but we also have debaters. So for our debating community specifically, I'd love you to give us, if you were an hardcore member, of course, you've been on a lot of CAPs this year. I think you have been on a roll, actually. So if you're an hardcore member one more time and you need to, set a motion to discuss this specific issue, what would that motion be?
I have two. The first is one I mentioned about what the TPLF should do. So to read something that this House, as the Tigray regional government, would pursue secession from the Federal Republic of Ethiopia. So this would be one version of a motion where the Tigrays can form their own bloc, maybe with the Oromos, however they do it, just secede or pursue this overthrowing, because that's what they're really pursuing right now. Yeah. That would be one debate that would probably be interesting. Not sure if it's too balanced. I think it's something that you can test out. The second thing you can argue here is with regards to the formation of the parties. So what we had was the EPLF, where we had different parties from different ethnic groups, and then you form a coalition. And then what Abiy Ahmed did was form a party of national unity, like one huge party. So we can argue about this House prefers the system of ethnic party coalitions compared to one single party of national unity, and which of the two is a best system for Ethiopian politics going forward. Do you have one party with everyone, or do you let everyone govern themselves in their own parties, then form a coalition, and everyone can just bring their own interests? That would be another interesting motion, I think, but it's very spec, so I don't know how many people would know what's going on. The problem with most debaters, they don't read about Africa. So whenever you set an African motion, it's, oh, nobody knows about that. Yeah, so anyway.
All right, thank you very much for joining us on the program today. We can't thank you enough. We are exceedingly grateful, and we hope that we'll see you some other time when we'll call you on the program.
All right, thank you so much, Eze, for the invite.
Thank you. Great.